In the twilight hours before dawn, when the world is quiet enough that even distant memories seem to breathe, a faint signal pulsed through the static of an Allied listening post on the English coast. It was brief, barely a whisper in the noise, but it carried a pattern no one expected. The operator who caught it would later say he wasn't sure why he paused, why he leaned in, why he replayed it instead of brushing it aside, like the dozens of anomalies he heard every night. But that hesitation would uncover one of the most elusive wartime mysteries ever recorded, one that remains sealed for decades. And this story begins not with a coded message or a clash on the front lines, but with a man standing alone on a cold beach, staring at the waves as if waiting for something or someone to return. His name, at least the one he used, was Samuel Hargrove. Most who met him assumed he was just another resident of the small coastal village nearby, a quiet, solitary figure who spent more time walking along the shoreline than speaking to his neighbors. They didn't know he arrived only months earlier. They didn't know he avoided cameras. And they certainly had no idea that he carried a small metal cylinder hidden beneath the floorboards of his rented cottage. A cylinder containing a message written in a hand that wasn't his, in a language he pretended not to understand. The message was dated June 1942, yet the ink was barely faded, as if it had endured something far stranger than time. But to understand Samuel, or the man he used to be, you have to go back to a night in early June, when a weather-beaten submarine surfaced just off the American shoreline. The crew inside was exhausted, their faces thin, their nerves stretched by weeks of travel beneath unpredictable waters. Among them were men who believed they were on a mission that would change the balance of the war, though not all agreed with what they were ordered to do. Even now, years after the files were declassified, historians argue over whether this group was composed of loyal operatives, reluctant participants, or something in between. What is known for certain is that this mission would fracture before it even began. 4 men climbed into a rubber raft, carrying crates sealed with wax and marked only with numbers. Waves struck against the raft as they paddled toward the dark stretch of beach ahead. No lights, no moon, no welcome. Just the shoreline, isolated and silent. They reached the sand, buried their equipment, changed into civilian clothes, and waited for the submarine's signal confirming their landing had gone unnoticed. But the confirmation never came. The submarine slipped beneath the surface and vanished. Not because the men were compromised, but because the captain believed if he stayed a moment longer, they would all perish under the growing threat of patrols. What happened next was not part of anyone's plan. The 4 men split up after reaching land. 2 moved inland toward the rail lines where they hoped to disappear into the movement of freight cars. The other 2 followed the coast, one of them being the man we would one day know as Samuel. At the time, his real name was not Samuel, nor was he a resident of any quiet English village. He was a trained operative, fluent in 3 languages, and chosen specifically for his ability to blend in. Yet for reasons that remain unclear, he hesitated after coming ashore. Something shook him that night, something that transformed his mission into something else entirely. He and his partner had barely walked an hour inland when they began to hear a vibration in the distance. At first it was subtle, a dull, heavy tremor moving through the ground. But the rhythm was too steady to be natural. They stepped off the road and waited behind a line of shrubs until the source appeared. A convoy of trucks, all unmarked except for a thin stripe of paint that had been hastily covered, as if someone wanted the vehicles to blend in with local traffic but hadn't finished the job. The trucks moved slowly, weighed down by cargo hidden beneath tarps. There were no soldiers escorting them, no headlights, no identifiable insignia, just engines humming in the night. Samuel's partner whispered that they should avoid them entirely. Their orders were clear: stay invisible, avoid recognition, and rendezvous with the others later. But Samuel wasn't looking at the trucks. He was listening, not to the engines, but to the sound coming from beneath the tarps. A faint, rhythmic tapping, a pattern, not random, a code. He recognized it instantly, not because he had heard it before, but because he had been trained to decipher patterns faster than most. And whatever was inside those trucks wasn't cargo. It was sending a message. Samuel wanted to investigate. His partner refused, insisting they had no time and no authority to interfere. The mission required precision, secrecy, compliance. But Samuel felt a pull he couldn't explain. He stepped toward the road, just enough that his boots touched the gravel shoulder. His partner tightened his grip on Samuel's jacket and hissed at him to stop. And then the convoy brake lights flashed. The truck slowed, then stopped. The tapping beneath the tarps intensified, almost frantic now. Samuel and his partner froze, unsure whether they had been spotted or whether something else triggered the halt. A moment later, a figure stepped out of the lead truck. He walked to the rear container and stood still for several seconds, as if listening. Even from a distance, Samuel could see the way the man's shoulders stiffened. Something wasn't right. The man signaled to another, who jumped down to join him. They both leaned close to the tarp, exchanging tense whispers. Then everything went silent. No tapping, no movement, just the sound of wind brushing through the grass. The two men opened the back of the truck. That's when Samuel realized that what he thought was tapping from inside the container was actually coming from something else. Something metallic clinking against the frame, as if reacting to movement within. His partner pulled him away again, insisting they continue toward their safe house. But Samuel dug his heels into the ground. Whatever was inside that truck was the reason the tapping had stopped. Because something, or someone, inside had seen the men open the container. Samuel and his partner watched from the shadows as the two truck operators stepped back abruptly. One of them muttered something Samuel couldn't catch. The other shook his head, slammed the container shut, and pounded on the side of the vehicle twice, a signal to move. Within seconds, the convoy restarted, rolling forward in a slow, deliberate line until the darkness swallowed their red taillights. Samuel stood motionless, staring at the spot where the trucks had been. That was the first moment he considered abandoning his mission. Not for fear, not for hesitation, but because he had a sinking realization. Whatever he had just witnessed was not part of any operation he recognized. It didn't belong to his side, nor the opposing side. It didn't align with military patterns, civilian transport, or covert supply lines. It was something else, something deliberately hidden, moving without oversight, yet able to cross entire regions unnoticed. He knew then that his mission, whatever it had been originally, no longer mattered. Something far more secretive was occurring right under their feet. Something involving coded signals traveling in the night inside sealed containers. And for the first time since leaving the submarine, he felt the weight of uncertainty settle in his chest. Hours later, Samuel and his partner reached the abandoned farmhouse where they were supposed to meet the other two operatives. There was no sign of them. No footprints, no marks of activity, no radio signal. Only a lantern left burning on the windowsill, a prearranged signal meant to show the location was secure. But the moment Samuel saw it, he knew something was wrong. The flame flickered unnaturally, as if reacting to a draft. But there were no broken windows, no open doors. The glass was intact. Everything was sealed. His partner stepped inside first, scanning the room carefully. Samuel followed, his instincts gnawing at him. They checked every room. Nothing. No signs of struggle, no abandoned equipment. The beds were untouched. The table was undisturbed. But then Samuel noticed something near the back wall. A faint line of dust, disturbed as though someone had dragged something heavy across the floor. It led toward a trap door they hadn't been told about. His partner insisted they ignore it. Their rendezvous instructions didn't mention any cellar. They weren't authorized to explore beyond the main floor. But Samuel didn't care about authorization anymore. He kneeled, brushed away the dust, and lifted the trap door. A breath of cold, stale air drifted upward. And in that moment, he understood something terrible. Someone else had been using this farmhouse long before they arrived. Someone who didn't want to be found. What Samuel discovered beneath that trap door would shatter the mission, reshape his identity, and eventually force him into a life under a new name in a quiet English village, haunted by what he carried. It would also explain the signal intercepted years later, because the message in that cylinder beneath his cottage floorboards was written by one of the men who vanished before he opened that trapdoor. And the final line of that message was a warning that had not yet come to pass. The air rising from the cellar felt colder than it should have, not the ordinary chill of underground stone, but a stillness that suggested the space had been sealed more recently than the dust on the floor implied. Samuel held his breath and listened. No voices, no movement. Just the creak of the old house and the faint ticking of his watch. His partner muttered that this was a mistake, that every second they spent off-script increased the risk of discovery. But Samuel had already committed, one hand on the edge of the trapdoor, the other reaching down into the darkness for the first rung of the ladder. If someone had been here, they had either left in a hurry or were still below. Either possibility was dangerous. Either possibility meant that the mission they thought they understood was only a small fragment of something larger. So Samuel climbed down. The wood groaned softly under his weight, and with each step, the light from the farmhouse above retreated until it was a pale rectangle overhead, framing his partner's anxious face. Then his boots touched the packed earth at the bottom, and a faint metallic echo responded to the impact, as if something in the corner of the room had quivered at his arrival. His eyes adjusted slowly. The cellar was low and narrow, supported by old beams, lined with shelves, stacked haphazardly with jars and crates. At first glance, it could have passed for any rural storage space, but the longer he looked, the more details stood out. There was a strip of newer wood hammered into one wall, covering something that had once been a small window. A metal cot stood against the far side, its frame recently disturbed. The thin mattress was still indented as if someone had been lying there not long ago. A half-burnt candle sat on a crate beside it, wax hardened in a crooked line. Samuel moved further in and noticed something curious near the base of one shelf. A metal cylinder about the length of his forearm, tucked just out of sight. It wasn't dusty. It hadn't been there long enough to blend into the cellar's age. He crouched, picked it up, and felt the unexpected weight of it. His thumb found a set of engraved numbers near one end, numbers arranged in a way he recognized immediately. Coordinates paired with a date. The date matched their landing night. He called up softly to his partner, who reluctantly descended the ladder, muttering warnings under his breath. When he reached the ground, Samuel handed him the cylinder. The other man held it like it might explode, turning it over carefully, eyes lingering on the engravings. There was no obvious method of opening it, no latch, no seam. It looked sealed, as if whatever was inside was never meant to be removed. Samuel had seen devices like this before, though not often. They were used for high-priority communications, messages that could be recovered even if the carrier didn't survive the journey. They were designed to be durable, waterproof, resistant to impact and heat. In theory, they could last for decades. In practice, most never made it where they were supposed to go. He traced one of the numbers with his gloved finger and realized with a sudden jolt that the coordinates didn't match their current location. They pointed somewhere inland, near a junction of roads and rail lines, a logical place to move cargo or to divert it. His partner shook his head and insisted they leave everything as it was. They had no idea who had used this cellar or why, and it was exactly the kind of unknown situation their training told them to avoid. But Samuel's mind kept circling back to the convoy they had seen earlier, to the faint, coded tapping coming from inside the trucks. The rhythm, the urgency. It had stopped at almost the exact moment the lead vehicle had halted. What if the trucks were headed toward the coordinates on the cylinder? What if the tapping was not just a message, but a plea that someone had devised in desperation, hoping that somewhere along the route it would be heard? Samuel suggested they at least search the cellar for more clues. His partner reluctantly agreed, but as they moved deeper into the cramped space, something else caught Samuel's attention. Faint markings scratched into the support beam near the cot, thin lines carefully carved, forming letters in a different language. He stepped closer. Even in the dim light, he could make out enough to feel his stomach tighten. The message wasn't long, just a few words etched with a shaky hand, as if written by someone who had to work quickly or who was struggling to remain steady. It mentioned a date only a few days in the future, and a single phrase that translated roughly to final transport. Beneath that was a symbol used by a branch of intelligence Samuel knew by reputation only, a group operating at the edges of official control, running projects that even their own governments preferred not to acknowledge. He had always assumed those stories were exaggerated, myths circulated in training to keep recruits cautious. But here, carved into an old beam in an unremarkable farmhouse, was evidence that such operations were real and that this house had been one of their waypoints. Before they could say anything more, a sharp noise from above snapped them both into silence. The muffled crunch of tires on gravel. A vehicle had stopped outside. Then a second. Voices followed, distant at first, then clearer. Samuel extinguished the lantern in the cellar, plunging them into darkness. His partner hissed that they had to get out, that if they were discovered with the cylinder and the coded markings, there would be no plausible explanation. But there was nowhere to go. The cellar had no exit besides the trap door, and someone was moving around the ground floor. Footsteps approached overhead. The trapdoor's outline dimmed as a shadow crossed it. For a moment, Samuel thought this was the end of their mission, and perhaps of their lives. But instead of opening the door, the person above moved away again. More footsteps. The scrape of chairs, the thump of boots. It sounded like at least 3 or 4 people. One of them spoke, their accent difficult to place from below, but their tone was irritated, impatient. They mentioned a delay. They mentioned the trucks. They mentioned that 2 of the men had not yet returned. Samuel and his partner exchanged a glance in the darkness. 2 men missing. Their other teammates, or someone else entirely? Another voice replied, lower and more controlled, saying that it didn't matter who was missing. The timetable would not change. The final movement of the transport was already set. No revisions, no exceptions. For what felt like an eternity, the cellar remained a silent witness, while the unseen group upstairs discussed routes and schedules. Certain words floated down through the boards. Coastal patrols, harbor inspections, rerouted trains. At one point, one of the voices asked if the subjects had shown any further resistance. The controlled voice replied that resistance was no longer an issue, that the most disruptive individuals had been separated and moved under stricter supervision. The others, he said, would not last long enough to pose a problem. Though the words were clinical, detached, Samuel heard what was hidden inside them. A quiet confirmation that whatever these people were moving was not cargo in the ordinary sense. These were lives being counted, managed, and written off like expendable resources. Eventually, the voices faded as the group left the farmhouse. The distant engines rumbled to life, then rolled away. Only after the last vibration faded did Samuel dare to move. He and his partner climbed back up, pausing in the empty room where moments before strangers had made decisions that would shape the fate of people neither of them had ever met. His partner wanted to abandon the location immediately, melt into the countryside, and reconnect with their original plan. But the plan now felt like a relic from another reality, one in which their mission had mattered and the lines between friend and foe were cleanly drawn. Samuel picked up the cylinder again and slipped it into his coat. His partner protested, but Samuel ignored him. Whatever this object represented, it was the only tangible link they had to the hidden operation they had glimpsed by accident. Without it, all they had were overheard fragments and a fading memory of tapping inside steel walls. They left the farmhouse under a sky beginning to lighten at the horizon. Dawn was coming. With it would come more patrols, more eyes. They moved through the fields, cutting across hedgerows, staying off the main roads. As they walked, Samuel's partner grew more agitated. Finally, he stopped and faced Samuel directly, the early morning light casting long shadows between them. He said that if Samuel persisted in carrying the cylinder, he would be forced to report it to their superiors. He spoke of loyalty, discipline, and the danger of improvisation in such an environment. Samuel listened, feeling the weight of the cylinder against his ribs. Then he quietly asked a question his partner could not easily answer. What if their superiors already knew about the trucks? What if this entire region, this farmhouse, this route, were part of a parallel operation running alongside their own, one that they had never been meant to notice? If that were true, then going back and reporting everything might not expose a hidden crime. It might simply alert the very people orchestrating it. The idea unsettled his partner, but he refused to entertain it. Conspiracies of that scale, he argued, were impractical. Too many moving parts, too much risk of exposure. Samuel didn't respond. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous plans were not always the largest, but the ones that hid inside existing structures, using them as cover. A few diverted trains here, a redirected convoy there, a handful of remote farmhouses rewritten as facilities. All under the chaos of a global conflict, where missing cargo and vanished people could be explained away as fog of conflict anomalies. It was simple, in a grim way, and it was effective as long as no one looked too closely. They walked in silence for several more hours until they reached a small rail town where they had been instructed to make contact with a local intermediary. The man they were supposed to meet ran a repair shop near the station, fixing clocks, radios, and anything else small enough to carry. From the outside, the shop looked unremarkable. A grimy window, a faded sign, a door that stuck when opened. Inside, however, the air buzzed with the quiet ticking of dozens of mechanisms, each marking time in its own tiny universe. The shopkeeper, a thin man with careful eyes, greeted them without surprise. He had been expecting visitors, though he didn't know who or where they had come from. That was how such networks worked. Layers of need to know so dense that no one person could easily betray the entire structure. Samuel and his partner provided the prearranged phrase. The shopkeeper nodded and led them through a narrow back room, then into an even smaller space lined with shelves of spare parts. It was there, between coils of wire and boxes of gears, that Samuel made his decision. While his partner discussed logistics with the shopkeeper, safe houses, documents, movements, Samuel stood slightly apart, listening as much to the rhythm of the clocks as to the conversation. Tick, tick, tick. Each second that passed was a second closer to whatever final transport the carved message in the cellar had described. He realized that if he waited for permission, for the correct protocols, it would already be over. The trucks would have arrived. The containers would have been unloaded. The lives inside them would have been reduced to numbers in a ledger. When the shopkeeper turned to him and asked if he needed anything else, supplies, clothing, a new identity, Samuel said yes. He reached into his coat, hesitated for the briefest moment, then placed the cylinder on the workbench. The shopkeeper's eyes widened just enough to betray recognition. He had seen something like this before. Maybe not the same model, not with the same markings, but similar enough that he knew it was important. His gaze flicked between Samuel and his partner, trying to understand why such an object was being revealed here, in this quiet little room full of ticking clocks. Samuel's partner reacted instantly, anger and fear rising at once. He demanded that Samuel put the cylinder away, that it was not to be shared with intermediaries. But the shopkeeper raised a hand gently and asked a question that Samuel had been dreading. "Where did you find this?" Samuel's answer was simple. In a place they had not been told existed. Under a house their mission had used, yet which clearly belonged to someone else's operation. Connected to trucks moving through the night, carrying people treated as subjects. The shopkeeper's expression tightened at the last word. He had heard it before, not in official broadcasts, but in rumors and whispered accounts smuggled across borders. Accounts of programs that took advantage of the chaos, that viewed human life not as something to protect, but as raw material. At that moment, the path in front of Samuel split. He could double down on his original allegiance, follow the mission as planned, and treat everything he had seen as a dangerous distraction. Or he could step off that path entirely and do something that might brand him a traitor, not just to one side, but to any side that valued secrecy above truth. The shopkeeper, sensing that a decision was being made, spoke in a low voice about contacts he knew, people who were not tied to any single government or command, people who kept quiet records of things that were not supposed to be happening. If the cylinder carried coordinates and a date, he said, then perhaps its contents had never reached their intended destination. Perhaps someone had dropped it on purpose, hoping it would be found by the right and wrong people at the same time. Samuel asked a simple question. Could the cylinder be opened without destroying what was inside? The shopkeeper nodded slowly. It would take time and care, but yes, there were ways. When he looked over at his partner, he saw something break in the man's expression, a sense of betrayal and disbelief. This was not what they had been sent for. This was not the operation they had trained for. Yet here they were, standing on the verge of turning their mission into something entirely different. In the end, Samuel's partner refused to take part. He declared that he would report Samuel's actions to their command, and that anything involving the cylinder, the cellar, or the trucks was beyond their jurisdiction. He left the shop, disappearing into the flow of the town, and Samuel never saw him again. Whether the man made it back to their superiors, Whether he survived the following weeks and months, Samuel would only learn years later, and even then only through incomplete files and secondhand rumors. For now, Samuel remained in the workshop with the shopkeeper, watching as the man gathered tools and cleared a space on the bench. It took hours to open the cylinder without damaging its contents. The casing was thick, built to endure impact, pressure, and moisture. The shopkeeper worked carefully, making small, precise cuts, occasionally pausing to adjust his angle or listen for any faint internal movement. All the while, the clocks kept ticking, marking the steady march of the deadline etched into the cellar beam. When the casing finally separated with a soft, metallic sigh, Samuel leaned in, holding his breath. Inside was a tightly rolled strip of treated material, thin but resilient, protecting ink that had hardly faded at all. The shopkeeper unrolled it slowly, weighing down the corners with small metal tools. At first, it appeared to be a standard encoded message, a string of characters that would require a specific key to unlock. But as Samuel looked closer, he realized there were two layers to it. The primary layer was a familiar cipher used for high-priority communications. The secondary layer, however, was something else, a subtle variation in spacing and stroke that suggested someone had hidden additional meaning within the existing code, like a message written between the lines of another. The shopkeeper stepped back and gestured for Samuel to take over. This, he said, was beyond his expertise. Samuel began to work through the cipher, his mind shifting into the focused state he had cultivated through years of training. The primary message resolved first, and its content was unsurprising if grim. Logistical details, transport schedules, references to units and materials being moved under special authorization. It confirmed everything they had overheard, giving structure to the vague sense of dread that had been building since the night on the road. But the secondary layer took longer. It required him to consider not just the letters, but their placement, the slight variations in ink where the writer's hand had pressed harder or lighter. When at last the hidden message emerged, sentence by sentence, it felt less like decoding a secret and more like reading a confession. The writer described being embedded inside the operation, carrying out tasks while quietly recording what he saw. He spoke of sealed trucks, of anonymous subjects, of destinations where no return trips were ever noted. He admitted that he had taken part, at least at first, believing he was serving a strategic purpose. But over time, the justifications thinned. The language used by his superiors grew more clinical, more detached, and he realized that whatever goal they claimed to be pursuing had already been overshadowed by the methods they were willing to use. The final part of the hidden message was a plea, not for rescue, but for interruption. The writer had managed to divert one of the cylinders meant for internal confirmation and encode his own warning into it. He did not expect to survive long enough to see whether it reached anyone. All he asked was that if someone did find it, they try to disrupt the final transport scheduled for the date carved into the cellar beam. Even a delay, he wrote, might be enough to create opportunities for escape or intervention. If you find this, the last line read, do not think of sides. Think only of what is being done in the shadows of this conflict. Decide if you can live with knowing it and doing nothing. Samuel stared at those words for a long time. Outside, trains came and went, carrying ordinary passengers, cargo, countless unremarkable stories. Inside the small workshop, surrounded by the measured ticking of clocks, he felt time compress. The deadline was no longer abstract. It was approaching rapidly, and somewhere out there, convoys like the one he had seen were preparing to move again. The decision he made in that room would send him down a path that would tear him away from his original identity, his original mission, and even his name. Years later, when he stood on the English beach watching the waves, those final lines would still echo in his mind. The shopkeeper asked quietly what he intended to do. Samuel did not answer right away, but when he finally spoke, his voice was steady. They would not send this message back through the channels it was meant for. They would not hand it to the same authorities who had created the routes and the trucks and the cellar. Instead, they would find another way, through people who were not supposed to know, through networks that operated outside official commands. It would be dangerous. It would make him a liability to more than one power. But as he looked at the hidden plea in the decoded message, Samuel understood that the greater danger lay in walking away. That was the moment he stepped off the path he had trained for and onto another one entirely. One that would eventually lead him into the ranks of those hunting the very operations he had once been part of, and one that would force him to watch as some transports were stopped while others slipped through the cracks. Not every story in this era had a clear resolution, a clean triumph. Many ended in fragments, in partial successes, in losses that could only be measured against what might have been worse. But for Samuel, the question raised by the hidden message never left him. If you know what is being done in the shadows, can you live with doing nothing? Years later, the intercepted signal on the English coast and the cylinder beneath his floorboards would answer that question in ways he did not expect. Because the man who wrote that hidden plea did not vanish entirely, and the final transport he had tried to stop left behind traces that refused to be buried. Within days of decoding the hidden message, Samuel found himself standing on the platform of a small freight station miles from the coast, watching steam drift upward from the rails like ghosts rising from below. He wore new clothes now, civilian, nondescript, and carried forged papers the shopkeeper had arranged. The cylinder, emptied but intact, was wrapped in cloth inside his satchel. Though its message had been extracted, he kept its casing as a reminder of the promise he had made, not to look away, not to allow the final transport to move without interference. But the path forward was uncertain. He had no squad, no command structure, only thin threads of contacts who operated outside the boundaries of any official uniform. The station bustled with early morning workers. Some carried tools, others carried lunch tins. No one paid attention to Samuel, just as the operatives behind the sealed transports intended. That was the genius of hiding extraordinary things inside ordinary schedules. People saw trains every day. They heard engines. They smelled coal and oil. None of it drew suspicion. And yet, according to the message, somewhere along this network of rail lines, one final movement had been scheduled. A movement that would complete a sequence of transfers, quietly shaping the fate of those trapped inside steel containers. He scanned the timetable posted on the wall, looking for anomalies. Most entries were handwritten, but one section appeared more recent, ink darker, strokes cleaner. It listed a freight line scheduled to depart at dusk, routed unusually far inland before circling back toward the coast. A detour of that distance made no logistical sense unless the cargo it carried required concealment. Samuel memorized the route. This, he suspected, was part of the final transport. The shopkeeper had provided him with the name of a contact in the region, a woman known only by the alias Moran. No one seemed to know her true affiliation. Some whispered she once worked alongside border couriers, while others claimed she had family lost to operations like the one Samuel hoped to disrupt. The only certainty was that she understood rail networks better than most and could navigate the spaces between official oversight and hidden traffic. Reaching her required moving through farmland and forests, staying off the main roads. By the time Samuel located the dilapidated grain mill described in the shopkeeper's note, night had already fallen. Moonlight cast long, silver shadows across the abandoned structure. He approached cautiously, aware that this meeting was as likely to be a trap as a collaboration. But when he knocked on the rusted door, a quiet voice answered from within. "You're late." The door opened just enough to reveal a woman with sharp eyes and a demeanor suggesting she had no patience for wasted time. She motioned him inside. The room contained a table, maps, and a lantern hooded to limit visibility from outside. Without waiting for introductions, she asked what he knew. Samuel laid out everything: the convoy, the cellar, the cylinder, the hidden plea for interruption. Marin listened with a calm that suggested nothing he said surprised her. When he finished, she said something that made his heart tighten. "We've been hearing whispers about a final route, something larger than usual, something that won't be repeated." She unfurled a map of the region, lines crossing like veins. With a piece of chalk, she marked the detour Samuel had identified. It connected to a seldom-used spur branching into the woods. That spur, Marin explained, once led to an industrial facility that had been shuttered years earlier. But recently, smoke had been seen rising from its chimneys again, thin, controlled, irregular. Work was being done there, though no locals had been hired. Samuel realized what that meant. The facility was active again, but off the books. It aligned with the writer's warning. The final stage of the operation would take place at a site isolated enough to hide whatever subjects the trucks carried. "Can we stop it?" Samuel asked. Marin didn't answer immediately. She studied him as if weighing the cost of telling the truth. Then she said, "Not fully, not alone, but we can disrupt it. Enough to create confusion, enough to delay, long enough that the people inside the transport might have a chance, some of them at least." Her words echoed the hidden message: interruption, not rescue. There was no illusion of a perfect victory, only the hope of breaking the pattern. Over the next hours, Samuel and Marin planned. They identified key junctions where rail switches could be tampered with, points where the line narrowed, locations where a small team could sabotage brakes or signals without drawing immediate attention. Marin had two associates, siblings who lived on the outskirts of a nearby village. The brother was strong, good with tools. The sister knew how to move unseen. They joined the operation quietly, accepting the risk without hesitation. Each had lost people to the war, people who had vanished without explanation. Samuel found himself moved by their resolve. They didn't know him. They didn't know the governments involved. They only knew that a line had been crossed and that someone needed to push back. The night of the transport arrived with low clouds and the scent of distant rain. The four of them moved into position along the route, hidden among trees and brush. Samuel took the lead near the junction, where they would try to divert the freight onto a slower track, buying precious minutes. Marin and the siblings spread out to sabotage signal relays and weaken a section of rail. They didn't intend to derail the train, too dangerous for the people inside. Instead, they aimed to force an emergency stop. As they waited, the forest felt unnaturally still. No animal stirred, no wind rustled the branches. Samuel crouched beside the switch, listening to the distant hum that gradually grew louder. Then he heard it, the heavy, rhythmic clatter of wheels on steel. A freight engine emerged from the darkness, its front lantern dimmed to avoid attracting attention. Behind it were several cars, each one sealed, each one locked, each one carrying the weight of the operation Samuel had stumbled upon. As the train approached the junction, Samuel's pulse quickened. This was the moment everything depended on. He reached for the lever, but before he could move it, a gunshot cracked through the trees. Samuel ducked instinctively. The bullet struck the ground inches from his boot, spraying dirt. Voices shouted from the shadows. Floodlights snapped on, revealing figures in uniform, more than Samuel had believed possible for a covert transport. They had anticipated interference. They had come prepared. Samuel sprinted from the switch as the uniformed men opened fire again. He zigzagged through the underbrush, hearing shouts behind him. Marin's voice called from deeper in the forest, urging him to move. The gunfire lit the darkness in blinking bursts, revealing silhouettes weaving between trees. Still, the plan wasn't lost. A moment later, a grinding screech filled the air as the train hit the sabotaged section of rail. Sparks flew. The engine wobbled violently, slowed, and then lurched to a shuddering halt. Samuel felt the vibration through the ground. They had succeeded, at least partially. The uniformed men redirected their attention toward the stalled train, shouting orders. Meanwhile, Marin and the siblings emerged from their positions, moving swiftly toward Samuel. But amid the chaos, something unexpected occurred. From inside, the sealed containers came pounding, louder, more desperate than the tapping Samuel had heard days earlier. The people inside knew the train had stopped. They sensed opportunity. They cried out, hitting the walls in a desperate attempt to be heard. The guards shouted to drown the noise, ordering the containers reinforced. But confusion had already spread among them. Some ran toward the engine. Others circled the containers. A few broke formation entirely, unsure which orders to follow first. Samuel saw his chance. He rushed toward the nearest container, staying low. Marin and the siblings followed, keeping to the shadows. When they reached the steel walls, Samuel pressed his ear against the metal. The pounding inside intensified. A voice, hoarse but determined, shouted something he couldn't make out. He whispered back, telling them to stand back from the door if they could. He and the siblings searched for weak points. The locks were industrial, but age and rushed construction had left imperfections. Using tools they had brought, wedges, pry bars, they began forcing one latch upward. It budged only slightly, groaning under pressure. Then another gunshot rang out. Marin cried out and fell. Samuel dropped beside her. The wound was in her shoulder, painful but not fatal. She urged him not to stop. "Keep going," she said through clenched teeth. "They can't silence all of us." The pounding inside the container increased as if responding to her voice. Samuel threw his weight into the pry bar. The latch snapped upward. One of the siblings moved to the second latch, forcing it open through sheer determination. A gap formed in the door's seal. Cold air rushed out. A hand reached through the opening, thin, trembling, but alive. Before the door could be fully opened, dozens of guards surged toward them. Samuel shouted for the siblings to get Marin to safety. He remained, gripping the door, trying to widen the gap enough for the people inside to slip through. But the guards closed in quickly. He felt the barrel of a rifle slam against his back. He turned slowly. The man who stood behind him wore a uniform unlike the others. Cleaner, more decorated, his expression cold and controlled. His voice carried the same tone Samuel had heard in the farmhouse days earlier. "You should not have interfered," the man said. "You do not understand what we were trying to accomplish." Samuel stared at him. "I understand enough." The officer raised his weapon, but before he could fire, shouting erupted from the tree line. Figures emerged, partisans who had been watching from afar, alerted by the chaos. They charged the guards, weapons drawn. Gunfire erupted across the rail line. The officer turned, momentarily distracted. Samuel seized the moment. He threw himself at the container door, pushing it open enough that several figures inside could spill out. Some crawling, some stumbling, their eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. The officer, realizing what was happening, swung back toward Samuel, but the partisans closed in, forcing the guards to retreat toward the engine. It was chaos, but it was enough. More people poured from the container. Some collapsed on the ground, weak from confinement. Others helped each other, forming a chain. Samuel directed them toward the forest, where the siblings were waiting for them to retreat deeper into safety. By the time the officer managed to regroup with his men, half the people from the container had already vanished into the darkness. The others followed as fast as they could, aided by partisans. Samuel stayed behind until the last possible moment, making sure no one remained inside. He turned to flee, but the officer was waiting for him. A single shot rang out. Samuel staggered, feeling the impact in his side. The world tilted. He fell to his knees. The officer approached, rifle raised again. But before he could fire a second time, Marin, bleeding, limping, but alive, appeared behind him. She swung a heavy branch with all her strength. The officer crumpled. Marin grabbed Samuel, hauling him away from the tracks as more guards began to return. Together, they disappeared into the forest with the others. It took days for Samuel to recover, hidden in a partisan camp deep in the woods. Many of the people rescued from the containers were moved through secret routes, eventually making their way to safer territories. Not all survived the journey, but many did, and all because of a single interruption. When Samuel was strong enough to travel, Marin gave him a new set of papers, one last identity in a line of identities he had assumed. She told him the network would remain active, that more transports existed, though none as large as the one they had disrupted. She told him he had a choice, continue with them or disappear. He chose disappearance, not out of fear, but because he understood that his former superiors would now hunt him. He had crossed a line no operative was meant to cross. He had acted according to conscience, not command. Years later, in a coastal English village, he lived quietly under the name Samuel Hargrove. The cylinder he had emptied remained hidden beneath his floorboards, a reminder of the man who wrote the hidden message and of the people rescued from steel walls in the night. And then one evening, he received a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a single page. No words, only a symbol. The same symbol carved into the cellar beam. But this time, beneath it, someone had added a brief note. They survived. Some of them still remember the voice that told them to stand back. Samuel folded the note carefully, placed it beside the cylinder, and closed the floorboard. The waves outside rolled against the shore, steady and calm. He had kept his promise. He had not looked away.